Monogram Models was founded by Jack Besser and Robert Reeder in 1945. Both men had worked at Comet Models before World War II, but upon their return to Chicago, they founded their own company. They initially began out of a basement of Reeder's mother's house. They quickly found a place to set up a more permanent operation and began making wooden model kit ships that were easy to assemble and had a good look. In 1946, they introduced a flying model called the Whirlwind, a flying model that did not really resemble any particular airplane, but it was easy to build and it flew well. In 1949, Speedy-built kits were introduced. These were flying models of real planes that came with many pre-shaped parts. This made them easy to build, and as a result they were popular kits. But as the line expanded, the heavier pre-made parts, often made of solid balsa, made them hard to fly. Sometimes they didn't really fly at all. But the kids liked the looks, especially of the warbirds. In 1951, super kits were introduced. These were non-flying scale models for display purposes. They were made of wood, but the woodworking machines of the era could not really cut the fine details. Super kits sold, but not as well as hoped, and the line only lasted about 4 years. Monogram had moved to a bigger facility, but the conservative management of Jack Besser and Robert Reeder meant that it also ran a tight ship. So, despite this expense, Monogram was on a solid financial footing, a situation that would become characteristic of Monogram under the leadership of Reeder and Besser. Monogram's conservatism meant that they were a bit slow getting into plastics. Even though Hawk Models had introduced plastic kits as early as 1946, many modelers thought plastics were a flash in the pan. Then in 1951, Revell started making plastic kits. In 1952, both Aurora and in Europe, Airfix were starting to make plastic model kits. Even to old-school wooden model builders like Besser and Reeder, it looked like they needed to give plastic some serious thought. This is where the old school and the new school collided. Old-school modelers believed in craftsmanship, woodworking, and artisan practices. Besser and Reeder did not want to see those skills lost, but they also knew that this was a business, so they hit upon a compromise. In 1953 to 54, plastic detail parts that could not be cut on industrial wood lathes were added to the kits. This served three purposes. It gave the models a nicer look, they were easier to build, and it preserved some of the woodcrafting skills. And as a bonus, it helped draw the attention of kids. It did help sales. But Monogram was slow to move entirely to plastics. This conservative approach may have limited their market saturation, but it also limited their exposure. Setting up for plastics was a hugely expensive endeavor. Mold making was expensive and time-consuming. Most companies took about a year from the time they committed to building a plastic kit model until it was actually on the store shelves. After starting in all plastics with model cars and boats, Monogram released 6 all-plastic model airplane kits. They also included very nice store displays. The models were packaged in uniform-sized boxes that had store shelves in mind. They were also cleverly marketed as gift packs. As plastic models grew in popularity, so did Monogram's product line. Robert Reeder ran the shop. Despite his quiet and reserved demeanor, he was a stickler for detail and accuracy. Jack Besser ran the business end of things with an incredible energy. Always a physical fitness buff, Besser had a great deal of drive and stamina, handy traits when growing such a labor-intensive business. The two men made for a well-oiled operation. When combined with their conservative approach, this made Monogram a very successful company. In 1957, like the other companies, they started a line of military and armored vehicles, but they did something that confuses people to this day. They made some of the models in 2 near but different scales, 1/32nd scale and 1/35th scale. There was no standard back then, and Monogram just wanted to make kits that would fit into a standard box. Little did they know that this would drive some modelers nuts. The kits were not big hits, and although they stayed in production, no more military vehicles would be added until the 1960s. In 1958, they started a line of rockets and missiles. They even teamed up with famous German rocket scientist Willy Ley on a series of possible future spacecraft. These vehicles were all over the news at the time, and at first sales were brisk. But as these systems would fall out of the news or retired early by the military due to superior technologies, kit sales likewise fell off, and the series floundered. At the same time, other kits were enjoying great success as they got back into model cars. By 1959, building models was listed as the #1 boys' hobby, with 4 out of 5 boys in America engaged in it. 10 years earlier, it didn't even make the list. Aurora and Revell were beating each other up as they vied for the position of top dog, with the 1959 Aurora catalog showing 152 kits for sale versus Revell's 118. Monogram stayed out of the fray by focusing on quality, not quantity. Monogram's 1959 catalog only showed 64 kits, and almost a third of them still had wooden components. As with all the model companies, the 1960s brought change. In 1961, Monogram, having outgrown its current facility, moved operations to Morton Grove, Illinois. Having always kept a close relationship with their now 350 employees and not wanting to lose these experienced workers, Besser and Reeder decided to offer a bus service to the Chicago suburb to ease the transportation issues that the move might have brought about for employees. They did not really expect it to be very popular, but in fact it was, and continued for several years. This is also when Monogram put out one of its most iconic kits, the 1/32 scale Phantom Mustang. For such a conservative company, it was clear, pardon the pun, that Monogram did not hurt for imagination. This is because they'd hired a lot of very clever people to work in their research and development department. More and more kits were added to their line, and deals were struck with exotic car designers like Darryl Starbird and his futuristic Predicta automobile. As a response to Hawk's popular line of Weirdos, which were essentially plastic models of cartoon cars, the serious, straight-laced team at Monogram released its own set of model cartoon cars in 1964, and to great success. Monogram may have had a reputation as the choice for the serious modeler, but business is business. Monogram's ever-growing line of quality products and conservative management could not save it from a changing market. Sales were still good, but Monogram's management team was very aware that larger and better funded model companies were on the scene now, and that the marketplace was only going to get tougher. For example, from Japan, the Tamiya company had a well-established reputation for quality that raised the bar. Everyone knew, especially Jack Besser, that if Monogram was to survive in the long term, it needed more resources. That meant a merger, preferably to a powerhouse company. In 1968, Besser reached out to potential suitors, and to their surprise, Mattel Toys entered the picture. Mattel was the largest toy company in the world, and wanted to diversify into other areas. The problem was that kit models are not toys. They're hobbies. They're crafts. It's a different market, a very different market. Mattel's owners, Ruth and Elliot Handler, promised to keep all of Monogram's people in their current position, and the deal was done in October of 1968. Payment was made in the form of Mattel stock. When the announcement was made to Monogram's employees, there was a sense of dread about what was coming, despite being assured by Besser and Reeder that this would guarantee Monogram's future. The very next year, 1969, Mattel let the entire Monogram sales staff go, despite their promises to keep all of Monogram's employees. They handed the sales off to the Mattel sales department, but they lacked experience in selling models, which was a very different market than selling toys. Although Monogram still had a great deal of autonomy, Besser and Reeder had to go to California every month for meetings with the Mattel senior management. Every major decision required Mattel's approval. One thing they did agree on was when they recommended to Mattel to make a toy-like model of Snoopy's airplane. Mattel saw it had play value, and being a toy company, they liked it, and it was a huge seller in 1970. But development on serious scale models ground to a near halt. The real problem came later, as Mattel insisted on play value for models, which led to some real duds, probably the worst of which was the Sky Stick, this ridiculous control stick that you could place a model on and manipulate with a joystick. It really served no function. I would love to have been at that meeting. I'm pretty sure Reeder and Besser were about to pull their hair out. Well, Besser didn't have any, but you get my point. The monthly trips for California meetings with Mattel were wearing on Besser and Reeder both, and Ruth Handler wasn't terribly thrilled with Besser's constant pushback. He was not used to answering to higher-ups, and she was not used to having her orders questioned, but they made it work. In fact, in 1973, Ruth Handler admitted that firing the Monogram sales staff was a mistake and asked Besser and Reeder if they would like to take back control of the marketing. And they jumped on the chance. Unfortunately, Mattel had some underlying problems that Monogram did not know about, and they were going to spill over into Monogram in a big way. To make a complex story very short, Mattel had suffered some decline in sales, particularly of its Hot Wheels brand, during 1970-71, and instead of admitting the losses, they basically cooked the books, covered it up. The Security and Exchange Commission caught wind of it, and the fallout was the handlers were forced to step down. A new CEO took over at Mattel, and friction with Jack Besser began not long after. In 1975, the Mattel CEO went to the Monogram factory in Illinois and unceremoniously fired Besser. One of the two founding partners that started Monogram was out of his office that evening. Besser was replaced by Tom Gannon, who ran the business without sentiment, but wisely left Robert Reeder in charge of running things at the factory. Gannon oversaw such new ways of doing business as having molds made in China and updating the plastics pellet processes and a lot of other things. Production was increased and mass marketing was introduced. Gannon was a no-nonsense businessman who could be hard to work with, but he was very effective. He was also willing to tolerate pushback if something good was to come of it. Monogram continued to put out new kits and business grew. In 1977, they were able to acquire the now-defunct Aurora molds. Despite the train derailment that tossed molds into a muddy field, many former Aurora kits were put into production under the Monogram name. Eventually, even the popular Frankenstein figure. Monogram continued to come out with new kits and were making models in every category. At the end of 1983, Tom Gannon retired as president of Monogram, and shortly thereafter, Mattel announced it wanted to sell Monogram off. Gannon was able to get investors and bought out Monogram in 1984. Only 2 years later, the new investors decided to sell it again. In 1986, Odyssey Partners bought Monogram, and it already had an option to buy Revell Models. Whereas Monogram was consistently profitable, Revell was not, but Revell had the larger product line and overseas presence. And now, to the conclusion of the Revell Monogram story. Although Monogram was the buyer, ergo the dominant company, the decision was made to keep Revell's name on top, partly for tax reasons and partly due to their larger market presence and brand recognition. Despite this, the Revell plant in Venice was closed, the people let go, and the molds moved to Monogram's plant in Illinois. As I mentioned earlier, Tom Gannon retired shortly after the merger. The models were still produced and marketed under separate names until 1997, when they were fully combined into the Revell Monogram logo, with the exception of the Monogram Pro Modeler series. After this, there were a litany of owners. In 1994, it was sold to Hallmark. In 2001, Alpha International. A year later, Gearbox Toys. Then to the new Revell. And in 2007 to Hobbyco. Unfortunately, in 2018, Hobbyco itself went bankrupt and went into liquidation. This ended, at least for now, the Revell Monogram line, with the exception of Revell Germany, which is still operating. Someone may yet acquire the molds and put them back into production, but whether the Monogram name is permanently gone from store shelves or not, they existed for over 70 years and gave 4 generations of model builders a reason to open a tube of glue and start building.